I'd first like to go over a few housekeeping matters. This event is approved for CLE for any attorneys who are in the room. It's approved for 1 hour of ethics with the Oklahoma Bar Association. You do have to sign in and register and show the time and date that you appeared in order to get the credit. And typically the sponsor, which in this case would be Evita, she will submit that for credit approval by the Oklahoma Bar Association. One other housekeeping matter, if you're looking for restrooms, if you'll go to the far side of that exit room on the opposite side of the elevators, you'll see men's and women's restrooms. And then finally, as a housekeeping matter, if anyone, you're welcome to enjoy your food at where you're sitting, or get up during the presentations and go get additional food if you'd like some. I'd like to take a minute just to thank you for your attendance. The Oklahoma City University School of Law Center for Criminal Justice is pleased to host the 2022 Policy Reveal for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. Oklahoma City University Law School is home to two major organizations, the Innocence Project, which yearly represents individuals who have been wrongly convicted in the state of Oklahoma, and the Center for Criminal Justice, part of which is one of the things that we do is this event that we are currently hosting tonight. Through the incredible leadership of Jim Roth, the dean of this law school, this event is only one way in which the Center for Criminal Justice provides a support platform for organizations seeking to change the impact of the criminal justice system on everyday citizens. Your attendance at this event is proof that the public is not only ready for change, but they are willing to help implement change in the state of Oklahoma. Thank you for coming, and now some words for you from Marilyn Davidson. You can take one of those.
I'm going to borrow this. There. Good evening, and thank you everyone for coming. Please don't be shy, and you can sit in the front. It's okay. We won't throw things at you. As she said, my name is Marilyn Davidson, and I am here representing an organization called Right on Crime. We are a conservative group that is focused on reducing crime, restoring victims, reforming offenders, and lowering taxpayer costs. Right on Crime currently has 18 policy analysts, researchers, and law experts that work in 38 different states to advocate for criminal justice reform. I am honored to be here today and participate and honor the work that the Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform has done. OCJR has been instrumental in bringing together groups from varying backgrounds to advocate for reforms at the state capitol. The faith community, the business community, educators, service providers, and grassroots advocates are all joining us today, as well as both rural and urban interests. Most notably, OCJR is a rare group that brings together both conservative and liberal voices. Personally, at the Capitol, I like to tell everyone that's kind of part of our superpowers. Fighting together, OCJR has pushed for common sense reform, resulting in incredible successes, which we'll probably talk about some tonight. Just this past year, we passed a bill to eliminate most criminal court fees assessed to juveniles involved with the justice system. Yes. We helped shape legislation to address using incarceration as a punishment for failure to pay fines and fees. And we supported legislation that allows individuals on parole to earn credits that will reduce their supervision period. Every year, thousands of individuals leave prison or jail and struggle with employment. In Oklahoma, the unemployment rate for the formerly incarcerated is 5 times the state average, making this a vital issue in addressing recidivism and public safety. In response, the coalition has worked to make employment more accessible by reforming occupational licensing rules to create more opportunities for them to have a career. I'm particularly proud of our work to advance Oklahoma's historic clean slate law, which will give more than 100,000 Oklahomans better housing, education, and employment access. Studies show that about 6.5% of the people eligible for expungement will actually access that relief. This means that 93% of Oklahomans who are eligible for expungement weren't obtaining that relief prior to Oklahoma passing the clean slate law. The economic, career building, and housing impact of developing and tailoring the expungement process in Oklahoma will be transformative for thousands of families across our state. We can clap about that. So, simply put, the work done by OCJR changes lives, and we're very proud of that. Today, I am pleased to introduce someone who's played a pivotal role in the work these past few years. OCJR's new executive director, Damian Shade, grew up in Tulsa. So did I, so yay, Damian, for Tulsa people, I'm just saying. His professional career has involved nearly 2 decades of leadership in public education, journalism, advocacy, criminal justice research, and public policy. Shade is one of the primary architects of Oklahoma's historic clean slate legislation and has advocated for numerous successful legislative reforms. After nearly 3 years as the criminal justice policy analyst at the Oklahoma Policy Institute, Shade served as project manager for Prosper OK. During that period, Shade also served as the Policy Advisory Committee Chair at the State Priorities Partnership Network in Washington, D.C. That's a lot of words, just saying. He's one of the most intelligent individuals I have had the pleasure to meet, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. He didn't write that, I wrote that. And I'm proud to call him a colleague and a friend, so please join me in welcoming Damian Shade.
Thank you all so much for being here. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. It is a school night, and you all are here to hear about criminal legal reform. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your week to do this important work. My name is Damian Shade, and as Marilyn just said, I'm the new executive director of Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. We are a nonprofit focused on helping our amazing and robust criminal legal reform coalition in this state create a system that works for everyone and that actually makes sense, that better protects victims, that better reduces crime, and yes, that incarcerates and warehouses significantly fewer Oklahomans. So tonight we're going to talk about building a more just Oklahoma. I'm going to just walk over here and take speaker's privilege and just grab this guy. Let's see here. There we go. So I like to start my presentations with something happy and hopeful. This is my daughter, Gwendolyn Elizabeth, right? I'm definitely not a biased human being, but she's the most beautiful creature in the world. And I like to show her at the beginning of some presentations because she's awesome, and also because she's my stakes. These pieces of data, these charts, these graphs, this information that I'm going to show you, none of it's more important than her and people like her. There's not a single data point that you will see tonight that doesn't represent people, real Oklahomans, real moms and dads, somebody's daughter who someone loves exactly as much as I love that young lady. So this was a wonderful day. For anyone who remembers this is a picture of the day that the largest single-day commutation in American history happened in our very own tough-on-crime Oklahoma. More than 400 people went home that week to visit to be with their families and rejoin their lives. It's one of those moments that reminds me of what collective power can do. That didn't happen because of me or eggheads and, talking heads on television. That happened because of the people in Oklahoma. Regular people who are infinitely more important than I will ever be. You all made this happen. It is the criminal legal coalition in the state of Oklahoma that changed this. So when I came into this work after 2016, this chart reflects the status of the reality of Oklahoma's system. We were the largest incarcerator on earth. And the remarkable thing about this chart is it represents founding NATO nations, that is, the rich Western industrialized countries. What is not represented on this chart are authoritarian nations like China. And it is dispiriting to know that even now, with the massive reductions and reforms that we have made in the state of Oklahoma that have changed this chart, we are no longer the prison capital of the world, which is something to celebrate. We are still on a list with China and some of the most autocratic nations on earth with per capita incarceration. So what's the current status of our criminal legal system? The current status is better. We've closed prisons, we've reduced the overall population by about 21% since its heights in 2016. But Oklahomans still serve longer sentences than almost anyone on earth. People in Oklahoma spend around 90% longer in prison for larceny, theft, and fraud, 105% longer for drug sale and trafficking, and 115% longer for motor vehicle infractions. And it's a remarkable thought experiment, right? If you give longer prison sentences than anyone else in the world, what do you get? Well, we've gotten these pieces. Oklahoma incarcerates 77% more 18-year-olds than the national average. That means criminal legal involvement is starting earlier here for lots of folks than it happens across the country. Also, we are seeing people over the age of 65 incarcerated at a 72% rate higher than the national average, and those 60 to 64 at a 67% higher than the national average. It's something I said recently to a group of lawmakers. Our prisons are filled with sick, old people. I'll say that again. Our prisons are filled with sick, old people. And the question that we must always ask is, what are we getting for this bargain? We also see the racial elements of this, right, beginning to appear. So we see that Native Americans, prison admissions for them have grown 71% in Oklahoma in the last decade. And remarkably, for people of color from the black community like myself, we are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than our white counterparts, and Native American women in Oklahoma are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. We also see a real geographic divide. It almost doesn't make sense to say Oklahoma has one system. It's almost like there's 77 counties, and it's almost like we have 77 systems of justice. So as we can see, there are some counties that are literally sending an order of magnitude of their citizens relative to their population to the Department of Corrections on a regular basis. And as this incarcerated woman said, it seems like some counties are making their own laws. And something I always like to say, let's imagine you're a jerk. Like, imagine you're a person, you just don't care about other people, you don't care about communities, you don't care about families. All you care about is the bottom line. Remarkably, incarcerating these sick old people means that we are spending about $270 million more annually than if we had something closer to a normal incarceration rate, like New Mexico. Now, the idea that the citizens of Oklahoma are fundamentally more violent, criminogenic, and antisocial than the citizens of New Mexico or Kansas, I don't believe that. And I don't think most of us do. So something else is accounting for this. What this does to our workforce is another piece that's super important here. We have 150,000 job openings a month, and we have more than 200,000 Oklahomans with criminal felony records that are preventing them from living a normal life, doing all the things. It's remarkable. Just a simple thing like trying to go to college is so much harder if you have a felony record. The last piece of this, for those folks who only care about the dollars and cents, our long prison sentences, we have 8,027 Oklahomans who are with 20-plus year sentences. That is around $3.7 billion, with a B, $3.7 billion of our tax base that's gone. So does high incarceration make us safe, right? That's the bargain. That's what we are always told. If we lock them up and throw away the key, we'll be safe. No. Oklahoma is not safer. Look at these numbers. Our violent crime rate is 15% higher than the national average, with domestic violence being a particularly acute problem, county through county. Our property crime rate, 38% higher than the national average, and our burglary rate, 95% higher than the national average, again, according to uniform FBI reporting data. If the hypothesis is true, right? We lock them up, we throw away the key, we're safer. Why? Why are these the results of this investment? And I'd like to shout out to one of our coalition partners, the Oklahoma Appleseed Network, that's been doing remarkable work, really lifting up survivors. They recently had a presentation with this slide that I borrowed. These are domestic violence calls for service. In one county in 2021, each of those red dots represents a call. And if you'll see, there are 42,000 of those and fewer than 1,000 arrests. Some of those calls, they're not disaggregated by the individual. Some of those calls are women or individuals who called the police many times, and they never got the help they needed. Even worse, and this is the most important piece, many of those women, when the trauma of what happened to them drove them to cope with those problems with addiction, we locked those survivors up and we threw away the key. 57% of those women incarcerated, sexually abused as a child, 47% physically assaulted as a child, and nearly 3/4 experienced intimate partner violence within a year of their incarceration. We are making these problems worse. But there's hope in this. I don't tell you these numbers so that you can become sad and despair. I tell you this information because behind every one of those data points is a person like my daughter. There's a human being standing on the other side of that. So for 2023, we have 5 key priorities that I think are a down payment on the future of Oklahoma. We want to modernize our criminal code with common sense sentencing reform. Our criminal code hasn't been updated since the Backstreet Boys were a new band. Think about that. Smart investments in community safety and crime prevention by finally doing what voters demanded 7 years ago and funding State Question 781. We want to invest in families and communities by eliminating millions in criminal court fines and fees that mostly come from the poorest rural and the poorest communities in urban, dense communities of color. We want to boost government transparency and accountability by actually having a criminal legal data collection system that's a model for the nation. We are far from that at present. We can't even tell you how many folks are locked up in county jails across the state right now. And then that last piece, we want to incentivize work by developing an employment-centered reentry system and supervision system in the state of Oklahoma. Lastly, our long-term goals, I think, are relatively simple here. We want to significantly reduce the size of our incarceration crisis. World's highest incarcerators is a bananas list for our beautiful state of Oklahoma to be on. To better protect victims, the status quo is just failing too many communities. Treatment should always be easier to access than prison. We want to end the criminalization of poverty. No one should be locked up for 6 months because they can't afford to buy their freedom back from a bailsman or because of a failure to pay warrant. And finally, we want evidence-based best practices in Oklahoma, which is just a fancy way of saying if they've got a good idea in Texas or Arizona that's reducing crime and reducing the size of incarceration, we are fools if we don't adopt it here. Finally, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. This is one of my heroes. The first African-American woman elected to Congress at a time when my grandparents were still scared to vote because of terrible things that happened to them in Alabama. If they don't give you a seat at a table, bring a folding chair. Make your voices heard. You're all infinitely important in this room. And as I said, you're more important than I am. You're more important than any of these advocates. You are the people who our leaders and lawmakers listen to, and they are desperate to know what you think and what you really want. I want to thank you all for this time, and I think we're going to have a panel. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Damien. We're going to move rather quickly into a panel discussion about all the 5 areas that has been identified through Damien's presentation. I'd like to take a quick minute and introduce the panel speakers. And so if you would please, when I call out your name and title, if you'll raise your hand so the audience can see who you are and know who to call when they have an issue arise. Adam Maxey is the Deputy State Director for Americans for Prosperity in Oklahoma. Sarah Decker is the Legislative Strategist for the Prison Fellowship. Cindy Wynn is the Policy Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Oklahoma. And Gina Ritchie is the Ambassador for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform, and the team Reentry Case Manager, and of course, the wonderful Damien Shade, who gave that excellent presentation about the problems in Oklahoma. He is the newly elected Executive Director of Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. I intend to moderate this panel. My name is Loretta Radford. I am Legal Director for the Center for Criminal Justice here at the law school. And so let's jump right in on things with some questions about your policies.
Can I just lead out? I want to thank Loretta so much for being here and congratulate her for recently being appointed as a special judge in Tulsa County.
Thank you. Thank you. It's both bitter and sweet because I've absolutely enjoyed my time working in criminal justice reform here at the law school. But I do feel that working as a special judge is a great way in which to serve the community and to be a screen for what's happening in the courtroom. So I would also like to start by asking this question to Adam. And this is for the non-lawyers in the room. Can you describe for us how felony classifications take place in Oklahoma?
Yes. Can everybody hear me? Mike, good. Thank you for having me tonight. Well,
and in the same breath, Adam, explain why it's a problem.
Sure. I think it should be self-explanatory after I tell you I can't describe how felony classification takes place at the moment in the state of Oklahoma because there is none. For those of you who have followed along, we've pushed a bill in the legislature over the last several years. That bill is over 1,000 pages long because our felonies are scattered throughout the code in our state, and some duplicate, some off the wall, and it presents a dilemma for prosecutors, judges, and defendants. Everyone there is operating in a very murky space right now when someone is charged with a crime. So the way this works out in practicality, right, is we'll start with the defendant. They get the book thrown at them because there's no range for these crimes to be brought into. They don't know that our intention would be a B1 crime that carries 0 to 12. The defendant knows that they've been charged with a B1 crime, they have 0 to 12, and a prosecutor can't throw 35 at them, and they end up pleading like most of these cases do. Well, that's a misapplication of justice. It helps prosecutors across the state have a range for what they're doing and a way to apply justice evenly across the board. I think that one of the problems we run into is because we don't have a statewide classification system with sentence ranges. You can literally commit the same crime 1 mile apart. Here in Oklahoma City, you get pulled over at I-40 in Council, you might get one charge and one sentence. If you get pulled over at I-40 in Morgan, you get a completely different sentence because you're in a different judicial district, there's a different prosecutor, but you committed the same crime 2 miles apart. That doesn't make sense to me. It shouldn't make sense to anybody. And for judges, it allows them, again, it's a standardized process that creates certainty for everyone. And I think no matter what side of this issue you're on, defendants, prosecutors, judges, citizens, we all want certainty in our justice system, in the public trust that we put into these folks when we elect them, in what we believe in with our civil liberties. We want certainty in the system. So I think that's really what it's about, is creating certainty for Oklahomans.
So what's the resolution, Adam? How do we get out of that dilemma? Because it seems like the judges and the prosecutors are kind of in a matrix where you can give a short sentence that can end in tragedy. You can give a lengthy sentence, which is actually what drives the mass incarceration in the state of Oklahoma. So how do we fix that with challenging felony classifications?
I think when you put our felonies into a classification system, you allow for so much more that goes on to reduce criminal behavior, to reduce the prison population, to do all those things. All the savings, the fiscal savings the state can earn from these things can be plowed back into programs. Because almost everyone who's currently in DLC custody is going to get out someday. And we want them to have received the treatment and the job training and everything else they need to not reoffend when they come out, right? So that helps the justice system, the prosecutors and the judges too. They're not picking people up over and over and over again. The other part of this, of course, is sentence enhancements, right? And in this matrix and in what we're pushing for this and what we're looking to either end sentence enhancements or drastically reduce their ability to turn somebody who wrote a hot check 20 years ago into a 45-year sentence because they've got a prior. And that's not fair. And I think ultimately there is a dilemma for judges and prosecutors because in public trust. And they don't trust them either way right now, right? You get these bold ends of the spectrum. Either you gave somebody too short and something awful happens, or you put them away for life and you're not respecting people's dignity. And I think we can all come together and agree, because ultimately, whether politically right now under the dome, the advocacy groups want to admit it, there's a need and there's some certainty and there's ultimately some fallback that makes their job a little easier, and it helps them administer their departments and apply the law, protect victims, and do everything they're charged to do in an equal manner.
Thank you so much, Mr. Maxey. I'd like to direct the next question to our panel member, Ms. Ritchie. As Damien talked about, African Americans and persons of Native descent are clearly overrepresented in the incarceration system in the state of Oklahoma. Do you think that standardized and classified sentencing practices could help to alleviate some of the implicit bias, which is actually what happens during the sentencing process to create this overload.
Yes, I do believe so. Can you hear me? I do believe so. Coming from a past of justice involvement, I see that firsthand, especially in the rural communities. I come from a rural county. I remember sitting in court and I had a first time drug offense. And it was an empty bottle that they charged me with possession with intent. I'd never bonded out. I had a public defender, and so I was coming from county. I had another person in court that was before me that had been on of course I'm African American, and this gentleman was Caucasian, and he was on a deferred sentence for possession with intent. Now he's back in court reoffended, and they moved his deferred sentence to a suspended sentence, and he got a suspended sentence on the second charge. This is my first offense. I hadn't even had a speeding ticket. They gave me 5 years of incarceration. He got to go home on another suspended sentence, and he had over 2 ounces of drugs. I had an empty bottle. So yes, the disparities, because me being a black woman, him being a white Caucasian in a rural community, he got to go home. I had to go to prison. And so, so I believe that if we had a sentencing guideline that was standard across the board, no matter if you had a paid attorney, a public defender, who bonded out or who didn't bond out, if you had a sentence guideline, then everybody would be treated fair. You couldn't, we wouldn't have the disparities in race.
Do you know whether or not sentencing guidelines have been used in other states, like in our bordering states? And maybe Damien can speak to this, because I'd like to pose this question to you, Damien. One of the guiding ethical principles that we have in the law is that we need to work to improve access to justice. And so I'm wondering how our current ad hoc model of sentencing, like what Ms. Ritchie has described, how that impacts access to justice.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think what's really missing in our system is certainty. So there are numerous counties, just to give simple examples, in which the types of diversions, the diversion hub here in Oklahoma County, which does amazing work helping people experience homelessness or mental health issues and crisis, keep those people out of the justice system in the first place. Those types of reforms don't even exist across massive parts of the state of Oklahoma. There are 77 counties here, and there are huge gaps, spaces where, as we've talked about many times, where you cannot find inpatient mental health treatment, where you cannot find addiction treatment. And so much of what's happening in some of those counties where you're seeing these immense disparities is people who are honest actors, right? They don't even have to have racial bias or animus against anyone, but they are saying in their community, I don't have a drug court, I don't have a mental health court. There is nowhere for people to go when they are in those crises but jail and prison. So much of what creates and produces those disparities is the ambiguity of the sentencing that Adam was talking about, combined with the fact that we have not invested in the resources to actually deal with the root of these problems. Judges and prosecutors and law enforcement can only use the tools they are given. I think it was Maslow who has the quote, "To a hammer, every problem's a nail." So when you give them nothing but prisons and jails as the means to redress these issues, heck, I even go further than that, right? Before the judges and prosecutors get there, when you tell the police it is our job to deal with all of these mental health issues, to deal with all of these issues around people experiencing homelessness, you are fundamentally setting both law enforcement and those marginalized communities up for failure. And when you have sentencing systems that haven't been updated in decades, of course, you see the disparity across the state.
Damien, one of the things I'd like for this audience to understand is what a modern classification system would look like and how it would fix things. Now, I don't know who's in the audience, but I came from the federal system of sentencing, wherein we used sentencing guidelines, which was an attempt to try to treat everybody the same. And in working through those guidelines, we learned some things that of some of the implicit bias that is, for example, you probably remember from the news, the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine dilemma that the federal sentencing guidelines has. But what does a modern classification system look like for the state courts? Because they don't have the uniformity in those 77 counties.
Yeah, the simplest way to describe it is look at Kansas, right? Look at the way Kansas and both Arkansas have organized their crimes into categories that can easily be understood. So Adam was talking about the 1,000-page bill, right? That's necessary because Oklahoma's criminal laws are scattered across the code. Lawyer friends of mine talk all the time about having to find citations in massively different statutes just to understand a single criminal law. Right? To understand the field of expungement, which we recently worked on, you are dealing with all of these other pieces of Oklahoma statute. And in Arkansas, in Kansas, in places with classification systems that are comprehensible and updated, you don't see that problem.
Thank you so much for that commentary. I'd like to talk to Ms. Wynn about data collection, which I understand is a problem in Oklahoma. I'm hoping that you can share with the audience what data collection is all about, why it's critical to the criminal justice system, and what's the problem in Oklahoma. Oh, are you on?
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Awesome. I used to be a trainer, so I use like thumbs up and thumbs down all the time. Yeah, it's a bit of a problem. Essentially what it boils down to is when we get better data, we have better policies, and we can create better policies once we have those data, that type of data. However, the data that we currently have on a statewide level for our criminal legal system is very disorganized, or it is deprioritized, or frankly, it is almost next to impossible for the public to get their hands on any of that type of data. Frankly, if it wasn't for organizations like OK Policy and Ryan with Open Justice, I don't know how much data we would actually have about our current system. And a lot of times, our current criminal legal entities are very slow to adapt to any type of new technology. If you ever work for any type of county or local level or state government, you know that they're a bit slow of trying to get with the times. But we also know that a lot of criminal legal entities in our state are already collecting pretrial data. They already have that data. But what we also know is that it is almost next to impossible for any member of the public to get any of that data. We can't answer simple questions like Damien was already talking about, saying that we don't know how many people are in our jails across the state on any given day. We can't even get that number within a year. We don't know who is getting bail. We don't know who is posting bail. We don't know the people currently in our jails. We also don't know things like what type of charges are driving up incarceration within our state. We saw that today, President Biden pardoned a lot of people who had simple possession of marijuana. However, what we also don't know is that we saw a lot of the impact of State Question 780 of simple possession turning into misdemeanors. But then what we also saw after that was that people were no longer simply being charged with simple possession. They are now being charged with possession with intent to distribute. So what type of charges are actually driving up our incarceration rates, and how do we get this type of data, and how do we get all of the criminal legal entities on board for trying to collect this data? Because we know this is going to benefit every single Oklahoman within our state, and it is going to allow not only policymakers, people impacted, but it is also going to allow us to highlight the real failures of our criminal legal system, as well as highlight the successes that are working, that we can really look at and try to make even better. So yes, it is quite a problem within our state.
Now, I would imagine, Ms. Wynn, that it's probably easy to push a data collection program on what I consider our three biggest counties, Comanche County, where Lawton sits, Tulsa County and Oklahoma County, but think of all the rural counties who have no controls, period, may not even have the money for the kinds of IT it takes to set up databases. How do we make them more transparent about who they're arresting, who's going to prison from those rural counties, and making sure that they respond to data collection?
That is an excellent question. It feels like we are having to rein in a lot of entities and trying to get a lot of them on board, especially with rural entities that don't have as much resources as entities in Oklahoma and Tulsa, as well as other counties like you just mentioned. So a lot of what we are trying to pass with another House bill or a Senate bill and working with the Bail Project is trying to fund a lot of this data collection, because we know that our state has the money. And I always say that a budget is a moral document. We always have the money within our state. It is about where we can use that type of money. And it looks like we are needing a lot of this money for data collection, because we know, like I said at the very beginning, that if we have better data, we're going to have better policies for our state.
I see. Thank you so much. I think that's a great help in explaining the importance of data collection to this audience. I want to turn to Damien again, because I'd like to kind of talk about some of the, what I call the esoterical functions of the law, okay? So the Oklahoma Bar Association, I'm an attorney and I'm subject to the professional rules of conduct, but one of our rules, Rule 1.1, says that we understand that the law is a learned profession, and that among these tenets are devotion to public service, improvement of the administration of justice, and access to justice for our fellow citizens. Access to justice. That doesn't mean that anybody gets treated better than anyone else, but you get to come to court just like the poor person, just like the rich person, just like the person who's disabled, just like the person who's well functioning. So my question to you, Damien, for this audience is, do you think it's our duty as those in the legal world to make the government so transparent about its inner workings?
That's just a great question. Obviously, one that sits high in the minds of anyone here who might be interested in one day becoming a judge or becoming a prosecutor who hopefully works in a more restorative way, possibly becoming someone who's a public defender, or even working in this egg-headed world of public policy that we all inhabit. I think it's really important to understand that, as one of my heroes likes to say, the opposite of justice in so many places is not injustice, but poverty. So much of what makes our system, not just Oklahoma's, but America's criminal legal system function, is the preference for wealth over poverty, right? So there are people who commit identical crimes or are accused of identical crimes. One person has enough money to buy their freedom back from a bondsman. Another one can sit there. And I like to describe that access to justice default as a misery machine, right? Because when you go to jail, you are a legally innocent American. You are not convicted of any offense. You are a criminal defendant. And you sit there. How long can the clock tick? I always like to think about that in my life. How long before I get evicted? How long before I lose my job? When my daughter was under the age of 2 in Oklahoma, after just a few months, were I incarcerated and unable to bail myself out, I could actually lose custody of her in just a few short months. And so the clock begins to tick the moment that you are in. And criminal legal involvement sticks to people who are poor or from lower income communities like where I come from, much more so than it does wealthy folks. I'll never forget a good friend of mine from Sapulpa, Oklahoma, talked to me about when he was young and silly and drove around with a joint in his mouth, driving long before it was legal to even possess marijuana for medical users in Oklahoma, and he had drugs sitting on his dashboard, like just openly out, pills, other things. The police pulled him over. Of course, he spent the night in jail, but I'll never forget him telling me about going to court His parents got him an amazing attorney. They got a whole bunch of the charges off his rap sheet, and he watched in the court docket. He showed up with his lawyer, and he watched when person after person who had less drugs than he did, who had lower offenses than he did, ended up going to jail and getting charges put on them that were significantly more serious than what he got, because he got access to justice. He got access to a good attorney who had good relationships with the judges and the staff in the court, who knew how to utilize the system for his benefit. Why can't everyone have that?
Right.
In every county in this state.
And of course, Damien, all of these transparency issues impact the presumption of innocence, which is what our criminal justice system is founded on, right? There's a case that I like to teach in one of my classes called United States versus Salerno. And in that case, one of the justices asked this question: is a man as innocent on the day he's charged with a crime as the day he's found not guilty? It's an interesting concept, because what it means is throughout that entire platform, the presumption of innocence loses its weight as we begin to charge people with crimes, and some have better access, right? But I want to talk to Adam about some of this as well. In our Code of Judicial Conduct, there's a tenet that says we should act to promote public confidence in the judiciary. How can the public availability of data increase public confidence?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question and a concept, and something everyone up here has mentioned thus far. An underlying theme is in a democracy in which we live and function as society under our social contract, we do believe in the rule of law. And the public's trust in the rule of law is eroded every time they see a miscarriage of justice. When something goes wrong in the courtroom, when someone a bad person gets out on bail simply because they can afford it, because they were judged on their means to pay rather than their danger to society. Every time someone goes to jail ostensibly because they were poor and didn't get a proper defense. I go this time every 2 years. I do a lot of talking to groups like this around the state of Oklahoma about different state questions or members or things that are going to be on their ballot. And the number one question I get, no matter where I am, if I'm in Eufaula or Clinton or downtown Oklahoma City, what about the judges? What can you tell me about these judges? I don't know anything about them. Well, neither do I. I'm sorry. So your best guess is to close your eyes and scratch a box. But that would help the electorate across the state. Data on convictions, data on sentencing, data on bail, everything Cindy's talked about, Damien's talked about. We can collect all of this data, and it can not only inform our policymakers, making these decisions, allocating resources, seeking understanding, it can inform the public for the decisions they make at the ballot box and how they evaluate their community standard of justice when they elect judges.
But in that regard, Adam, don't you think that maybe there's a furtive attempt to be less transparent? Because how would people vote if they knew how many times a judge had been overruled by the Court of Criminal Appeals or sanctioned by the Court of Criminal Appeals?
I think people need to know that. People need to know. And that's, we all hear it in the news. I'm going to use, big examples that nobody can avoid in the news. When a seat on the United States Supreme Court opens up, no matter what party is going to put somebody up, the number one thing that's going to come up, maybe not the number one thing, but it will certainly come up in the Senate Judiciary Committee, is you've had X number of rulings sent back by your higher court. Why were you so wrong?
Right. Thank you so much for that. And finally, Ms. Nguyen, talking on this area of data collection, what can we do to increase the transparency? Is it just about money, give these counties some money, or is it about a combination of money, education, and supervision?
I think that's a great question. I always say that transparency is when you are a proactive communicator with the public in terms that they understand. So what a lot of people don't realize is that going to the Capitol is that unfortunately with our state legislature, they are one of the least transparent legislatures in the nation. It actually is one of the few legislatures that does not allow any room for formal public testimony, meaning that lawmakers that write these type of bills never have to hear about the impact of these bills from you or me whenever they pass these type of bills. So whenever we talk about transparency and trying to pass bills like the data collection bill or talking about funding is actually contacting your elected officials. I know it sounds like everybody says that, but it is so important, especially so in our state, when lawmakers, the only time they ever hear from the public is whether it is from an email, a phone call, or an in-person meeting. And if you have never been to the Capitol, let me know. I will take you there myself because I think they should hear from us. I think it is our house just as much as it is anybody else's. But also getting back to that question of how to increase transparency, not only on the policy level, but on the grassroots level. What does that look like? And I firmly believe in not only teach-ins, but also town halls on an organization levels. So if you are thinking about hosting town halls and educating the public about whether it's a state question, a data collection bill, or anything else to do with criminal legal reform, making sure that it is accessible as possible. So that can look like providing childcare, that can look like helping people with transportation, letting people know the bus routes. What time are you hosting these type of town halls and teach-ins? It doesn't necessarily have to look like a big production like this. It can also look like talking to your friends and family members and asking them, what are some things that you don't understand about the system, or what are some questions that you have? Can I connect you with the right person? So not only is it about policy, not only is it about the grassroots level, it is also knowing that this impacts every single person in our life as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, I want to talk to Ms. Decker about the pimple that I hate, which is the legacy of debt that we impose upon individuals who've been convicted of crimes. And so the first question that I want to ask of you to open it up to the audience is, what exactly are these fines and fees that we're talking about in relation to the Oklahoma courts, and how do they get assessed?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question and just for the opportunity to speak on this panel this evening. So when we talk about fines, we are typically referring to monetary payments that are to serve as punishment for a particular criminal offense. The fines typically have a range in statute, and then the court will assess a fine within this range. Or for some offenses, particularly like in municipal court, there may be a set fine amount already. And then when we refer to fees, we're talking about itemized payments that are added onto the fine that are used to fund larger priorities in the criminal justice system. For example, fines might be added on to the fees that serve to fund drug education and treatment or to fund community supervision. And these are often several itemized payments that are added on top of the punishment that is already imposed. And some of these fees may apply broadly across multiple different criminal offenses, and then some fees may just be added on for a particular offense. For example, a laboratory analysis fee will be added on to cases that involve a laboratory analysis. And while fines can be a tool that is used to appropriately punish people in the criminal justice system, it's important that fines and fees do not become imposed in a way that is overly excessive, or is that it's putting a burden on these individuals, an excessive burden to fund the larger criminal justice system. And one more thing when we think about fines and fees is that it's important to prioritize restitution, and that these fines and fees don't become imposed upon individuals in such a way that makes it difficult to prioritize that restitution is being paid to victims.
Now, many people in the community have criticized this whole fine and fee structure that the courts uses, right, Ms. Decker? Partially because the fines come from the legislature based upon the crime committed. The fees sometimes aren't even related to the charge, right? Do you have any idea how they assess these fees and how that impacts families who are trying to pay? So for example, in a misdemeanor case, a misdemeanor that typically could carry up to 1 year in the county jail and a $500 fine, but a gentleman walks out of a court with $2,500 worth of fines and fees to repay. How does that happen?
Yeah, it's because in statute, there's all these separate different fees that are added on top of the fine. And so individuals, like you said, the monetary punishment may be $500, but the fee that is added on top of that could even be more than what the fine was, which can place a large burden on families when these fees become excessive.
Okay, so is the legislature refusing to fund the courts and they're making defendants fund the courts?
I don't know if Sarah or her organization are ready to represent that, but I mean, I hate, just to jump in on that point, I hate the idea of attributing bad motives to anyone, right? But when you see a situation, right, where the legislature has consistently said, all right, we're not going to fund these particular government services, and we're going to allow fees for service. That is the way we fund Netflix to be the way that we fund courts. When they say that, that's the inevitable result of that, right? Whether it was their intention to create that incentive dynamic or whether it was not their incentive. If you fail to fund courts and you say criminal defendants, fund it for us, you create this perverse dynamic.
Good point. Good point. Another thing that I'd like you to talk to the audience about, Ms. Decker, is, and maybe Damien can address this as well. There's a new term floating around in the criminal justice system that certain fines and fees, whether or not they're crimogenic or not, and are they actually a deterrent for a crime? If you impose $2,500 on somebody, does that make them not want to steal meat out of the Safeway, right? And what effect does the relief from fines and fees have on crime and our recidivism rates? Any comment, Ms. Decker?
You want to jump in? Yeah, so while, like I said before, I think this is on, in some cases, fines can be a just punishment for a particular offense, depending on what the offense is and whether that is just. But at the same time, when these are, if fines and fees are imposed in such a way to where it's really difficult for people to hold down a job and provide for their family and to pay the things that they need to have housing and food on their table, then that's when it becomes problematic. And so it's important that ability to pay is taken into consideration when we're looking at fines and fees and somebody's ability. This past legislative session, there was a really good bill that passed that will require courts to take ability to pay into consideration at the time of sentencing. And again, if somebody's situation changes and they have an inability to pay on their installments.
I see. Thank you. Did you have a comment?
Just
James?
the biggest piece of this and families and the way this impacts them, I think about a bill that we were fortunate enough to be able to support last year that reduces most of the fees, eliminates most of the fees for children involved in the criminal legal system. I say again, for children involved in the criminal legal system, because if a child gets juvenile involvement, they are assessed with fees. Well, you might ask, if you're 12 or 14, how in the world are you going to pay for fees? Well, you don't, right? That's mom and dad. Or in many cases, that's a guardianship. I'm a kid who was in foster care when I was younger. That might be your foster parents having to deal with that criminal legal obligation. Think about that. One of our partners, the Oklahoma Policy Institute, did a remarkable report last year that was published about youth justice, where they interviewed children across the state, either who had criminal legal involvement when they were younger or were still in the process of some criminal legal involvement. And what they found is there were numerous kids who said, I sold drugs, I stole, I committed crimes to pay some of these fees.
Right.
Because I got brothers and sisters, and my parents, I grew up with a single mom in a tough situation, and there were times when $50 might have been the difference between us not having a place to sleep or not having somewhere to or something to eat. There are so many kids like that in rural Oklahoma, in urban dense communities like where I come from, that $50 or $100 for their family is the end.
Right.
It is a crisis for their family. That means the best thing I can do for my mom is sell some drugs. And it is the system that we have created that is producing those incentives for families.
And in fact gives these choices that that the outcome's not good either way it goes.
Absolutely.
Right. Ms. Decker, have you looked at any data that indicates whether or not the heftier fines appear on felony convictions or misdemeanor convictions?
Yeah, so because we don't have like we were talking about earlier, a clear classification system in Oklahoma, the fine that is assessed in the fine range may vary pretty widely depending on what the offense is, but fine amounts are typically higher for people that have committed felonies, and these are often people that are serving longer sentences in prison. And with working with Prison Fellowship, we work directly with people that are in prisons here in Oklahoma and across the nation that are participating in our Prison Fellowship Academy. And when they participate in the academy, they're often really excited when to eventually get out of prison and really seize their second chance. They've really transformed their lives. And we find that when fines and fees are imposed upon that people that are coming out of incarceration and have these higher degrees of felonies that have the heavy fines and fees, and then they're excited to get back to life. And it's difficult to find transportation, find a job, find a place to live. And then when they have hefty fines and fees that they have to pay, that can really hinder somebody's ability to succeed.
So in the long run, we potentially create debtors' prisons, right? The very thing we attempted to throw out in the early centuries. Can you speak to what, I know you've talked about some of the legislative efforts that have gone through by the grace of Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform to help ease this burden. Are there any other legislative efforts that have impacted this hefty fines and fees imposition on people?
Sure. Yes, there's been several legislative efforts in this area over the past few years, and we're definitely very thankful that this is an area that lawmakers in Oklahoma are passionate about and that they keep working on. Just to provide a few examples of some legislation. In 2019, there was a bill that changed a fee that used to be going directly to the DAs to then go to the General Revenue Fund, because when we have a fee like this, the DAs are charging a fee that would then fund themselves, and that sort of fee could create a perverse incentive. So moving that payment for the fee over to the General Revenue Fund can reduce any perverse incentives. And then in 2021, there was a bill that eliminated or reduced some of the driver's license suspensions that relate to fines and fees. Whenever people have fines and fees and they're unable to pay them and it results in other consequences like driver's license suspensions, it can really just continue
and you need
snowballing
a car to go to work, it
into
creates a
more
vicious cycle.
problems. Yes. And then, as we mentioned briefly this past session, there were a couple of fines and fees bills. The one related to juvenile fees that eliminated several of those that passed. And then the bill that I briefly mentioned earlier that requires more ability to pay to be taken into consideration. And then there were a couple of other fines and fees bills that did not make it through that we are hopeful to be supportive of again if they come back in 2023, which that would be Senator Thompson's fee elimination bill that would reduce several of those itemized payments that are added on to the fine amount. And then one I don't think has been mentioned yet is Senator Daniels had a bill last session that would provide an early end date for people if they are consistently paying their fines and fees over time, which would incentivize payment and then give some people early relief whenever they're working hard to pay their court debt.
Right. Thank you. Damien, I want to go back to this concept of funding, how we fund the courts. So have there been any alternative methods suggested for funding the courts? I mean, because if we've created this monster, how do we stop it?
Well, I mean, there's a simple strategy, right, in my mind, to ending this monster, and that's simply funding courts as an essential service of government.
With increase in tax
with an increase in the tax revenue that goes to the courts. One of the remarkable things, if you look at the budget of courts, of state district courts for the last decade, you will see over and over again the fines and fees don't cut it. They're not enough. 70% of what is assessed is never collected. I'll say that again, 70% of the fees we assess are never collected. And so that is hundreds of millions of dollars that are supposed to be funding courts. It's remarkable, some of the things on that list. Victim services.
Right.
There's a trauma hospital in Norman that helps victims of serious trauma and children that is funded by fee revenue. What happens if fewer people have speeding tickets? What happens if fewer people go to court for crimes? Are we really saying that the victims of serious child trauma don't deserve care and services depending on how many criminal defendants happen to show up for a docket? It just seems like a misguided approach. We've got to fund those services.
So essentially what happens is that debt just keeps growing because nobody's paying them. Like you said, 70% of the people can't pay them. And so what happens, I would imagine, when they show up for court or don't show up for court or bench warrant issues, they get rearrested. There's a $60 fee for the sheriff to come out and get you. And every time the sheriff comes out to get you, there's a $60 fee, right?
Absolutely. It makes me think of the Beatles song Tax Man, right? Like when you think of courts, right? They tax your feet. They tax your walking into the courtroom. They tax you actually, and I like to call it a regressive tax on the poorest communities, because if you're not talking about fines, right? If you're not talking about the criminal penalty for some offense, you're talking about everything else they decided to charge you because you were there. There are people, and you can find data on this, who have fees and failure to pay warrants who were never convicted of offenses. They were jailed for a certain amount of time, and then they were given a bill for their time in jail. And even though they were acquitted or maybe charges were never even brought up, they were told that they needed to pay, and they were threatened with the possibility of a bench warrant if they didn't. Think about the perversity of that. Innocent people that we pilfer because we can. We need courts disentangled from that incentive. It's too much power, and then there's too much perversity in it.
Okay, let's talk about funding and the concept of the prosecution system that we have. I agree. I'm sorry? 781. Okay. Just real quickly, Adam, I want to ask you about the principle about prosecutors, that a prosecutor has the responsibility of a minister of justice to not simply be an advocate. So how does the way the court system's funded make it difficult for a prosecutor to really uphold that value?
It's extremely difficult when you look at the moral dilemma they're in. In my personal opinion, I hold baseball as almost as American as the Bill of Rights. The only thing that's gotten anybody absolutely banned from the game, not in the Hall of Fame because they are deserving of it, is gambling on this game in which they were playing in, throwing the game for self-interest, monetary self-interest. We're asking prosecutors to do that every day because they look around at their staff and their friends. They care about these people's families. They know everyone in their office. They know that the entire infrastructure in which they're asked to operate in every day can at times be diametrically opposed from administering justice, or do I try to rack up as many fines as we can to fund this thing, because that's how it's got to keep going. And we have to do what Damien said. We have to take that out of their hands. You will get better outcomes if there is no financial incentive to levy fines and fees. The legislature takes care of it, funds the courts, funds the prosecutors, and allows them to focus on administering justice instead of fundraising.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to move to talking about State Question 781, which, and I'd kind of like to start with Damien. The first thing I'd like you to do for this audience, because everybody has heard it in the news, nobody really understands it. What was 781 all about, and what happened?
So I know these numbers can get really wonky, state question this or state question that. It's a simple way to describe it. So in 2016, voters in Oklahoma decided that simple drug possession should not send people to state prison. It should send people at the most to county jails. And if you go to a county jail, you can only stay there for the most part for 1 year for a misdemeanor offense. And the citizens of Oklahoma were saying, about 60% of them, we would rather my cousin, my friend, my wife, who's struggling with addiction, we would rather them go to a doctor and get help than a jail cell. And what State Question 781 was supposed to do was take the savings that the state would have from sending fewer people to prison who are struggling with addiction, and then invest that savings into communities, into every county across the state, investing in more addiction treatment, more mental health treatment, more services for people experiencing homelessness, more things that could prevent and reduce crime before people ever go to jail or interact with law enforcement in the first place. We are part of a coalition of people right now trying to get those millions of dollars. So your leaders, just so you know, they owe you millions of dollars that you voted for 7 years ago overwhelmingly. And it is up to each of us to demand that they pay that bill, because those are crime reduction dollars. Those are dollars that make our communities better and safer for everyone, and those investments will make it possible for us to end Oklahoma's incarceration crisis.
Thank you for that. So the real balance here is balancing public safety with individual rights, with the common sense need to budget a criminal justice system that's gotten way out of whack, right? So how do diversion courts work in helping to solve this problem?
So diversion courts are a remarkable tool. For those of you who don't know, that's things like drug court, if you are a person struggling with addiction, to go through a process where you are not hopefully criminally charged, but where you can receive essentially a deferred or suspended sentence where the criminal charges and conviction don't haunt your life. There are mental health courts and other specialty dockets for people struggling with mental health issues in crisis. Those courts are a perfect tool to pull people away from the criminal legal system, to put them in spaces, honestly, much more like what I would like to model for the regular criminal legal system, where there are treatment resources, trauma-informed care, counseling, housing resources, the kinds of things that transform people's lives. It is one of my favorite things to visit in Tulsa is a special services docket where everyone who comes in, the very first thing they say to them in that docket is, "We work for you. We're not here to punish you. We're not here to incarcerate you. We will hold you accountable for what you do in this program, but it is our heart to serve you." That's the model that we see at diversion courts, many of them across the state. And the biggest thing they need beyond anything else is resources. We have counties without drug courts. We have many counties without mental health courts. We have many counties without treatment and diversion pretrial resources. They need those resources, and there are millions of dollars on the other side of this policy for those counties.
Thank you for that. I'd like for Adam to explain to the audience whether there's a cost comparison between incarcerating individuals and providing treatment. Treatment has become one of the most talked about conversations in the criminal justice system.
Yes, because we've criminalized addiction because we have no alternatives, like as Damien's described earlier. I think treatment numbers can fluctuate on what a person needs, where they are, all those things, but I can tell you this for sure, it is less than what it costs to incarcerate someone. The average cost, $24,000 a year for like a healthy 30-year-old in the prime of their life with no medical conditions in a regular security facility. Multiply that by the 16,000 some odd Oklahomans who are incarcerated. That adds up to a pretty big bill. And get this, the number goes up the more prisons the more prison gets over capacity. Food service gets slower. The lines get longer. It becomes more work for the DOC staff. It's a compounding issue that as we continue to incarcerate people for a treatable mental illness or chemical addiction, it gets more expensive every time we do that. And we're taking those dollars and putting them in a place that is not near as effective, nowhere near as effective for an individual, for an Oklahomans that we all believe in, who deserve a second chance, that it could be used in treatment.
Thank you for that. I'd like to kind of turn the table a little bit now and have Gina talk to us about what it's really like on a realistic level to re-enter society here in Oklahoma after being incarcerated, and the impact that re-entry has if it's not successful, or if it's a hard task. What are the challenges or barriers to an individual and their family?
Well, it's really challenging, especially, it's better today, but, of course you're a felon now, so everything that you go over is housing, employment, and questions, and committed a crime. So you have to answer that question. So you have to defend yourself in every area of your life. So not only when you first get out, you have your court costs and fines, and that's the number one priority. They want their money first. And so when you're looking for employment, you're not getting the wages that you deserve. You might have a licensure. I had a lot of accounting background, and I wasn't able to work in that field when I got out as a felon in the state of Oklahoma. So I had to go to a different field. I had to go try McDonald's or something, and I had, it's almost like it barred me from my life. It barred me from my employment history. It barred me from my schooling. It barred me from everything about my life. I had to begin over, and so it's very difficult. Until I became a participant with Team, where I'm a case manager now, and they invested in me, and they partnered with me, and they helped me face those barriers and get across those barriers. They got me interviews with different, with higher wage employment. They got me, sober living. And so I began to rebuild my life, but I had to partner with somebody. I couldn't do it by myself. And that's what they face I face as a case manager team. People coming out of incarceration, it's almost like they didn't even complete their sentence. They're having to face it all over again in society. They're not getting the hand up. It's better today because you got the diversion programs, you got faith-based organizations like Prison Fellowship that are partnering with individuals that find themselves incarcerated. So a lot of times when they get out, the number is almost like branded across their face, a felon, because you got to answer that question in every avenue of your life, and it's not fair. They made a mistake. They made it, a lot of it is substance abuse or mental health conditions that led them to substance abuse, that led them to prison. They're not failures. They're very intelligent people. We just have to have the avenues or the advocates to help them rebuild their life, and it's not fair. And they're also scared because they know the cards are stacked against them when they get out. And so a lot of them feel like it's easier to go back to that environment and try to rebuild the life on and not having the proper help from society. It's almost like being convicted all over again after you finish your time coming out. So it's a task and it's a challenge to face when you get out. But you have organizations that help, and that's why I'm so adamant about partnering with my participants and helping them rebuild their life, because you have to rebuild your life. And even if the licenses that you have doctors, you have lawyers, you have some incredible people that are incarcerated, but that's all stripped away from them because they became a felon. So it's incredibly hard. But with Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform from TEAM and the faith-based communities and the diversion programs is making it easier, but it's still a challenge. I have a lady a particular lady, and I've shared this before, on my caseload, and she's done remarkable, but the piece that we're having the problems with is housing. She stayed in sober living. Nobody would rent to her. She was paying $1,800 a month to stay in a motel because nobody would rent to her. Every apartment she tried to rent from, because she was a felon, they wouldn't rent to her. Even after having 9 months of rental history from sober living, they still wouldn't rent to her. We finally got her in one place. One place opened the door, but they made her pay first month, last month, double the deposit, and so she had to pay almost $3,000 just to get into an apartment. That the rent is $600 and something a month. So it's the cards are stacked up against people coming out of incarceration, and it shouldn't be that way. They did the crime, they've paid their time, and they should be free to rebuild their life. But it's hard.
Thank you for those points. Very, very well spoken. Sarah, there's been an increasing momentum for holistic representation of clients in the criminal defense bar. And I'd like for you to talk to the audience a little bit about what this concept of holistic representation is, and how can thinking about the barriers to reentry help us understand holistic representation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. When I think of holistic representation, I think of thinking about the whole person and how a different criminal conviction may affect many different aspects of a person's life. And defense attorneys can really help their clients to understand some of the barriers that they may face depending on the type of plea deal or the punishment that's being sought at conviction. And the defense bar can also help their clients find different avenues for success based on some of the policy victories that we have had in Oklahoma that we've talked about today. We have lawmakers at the Capitol that are working on reducing the barriers that people face with criminal convictions, and it's important that the people that can benefit from policy victories know about the reforms that are going on here in Oklahoma. Just as one example of a reform that we haven't talked about too much this evening is this past session, an occupational licensing reform bill was passed that Prison Fellowship worked on alongside many of our partner organizations. And this bill will open many avenues for people with a criminal record to have state occupational licensing. Before this bill was passed, different boards could have blanket bans, like if somebody has committed a number of different offenses, they can't even apply for a state occupational license. And after this bill was passed, boards have to look at each individual and look at what rehabilitation efforts somebody has done and a variety of factors before denying somebody a state occupational license. And this bill also excludes many older records from review from state occupational licensing boards. So when we have these different victories that help people get back to work and get access to jobs after incarceration, it's important that that is communicated and that people understand their rights in those areas, as well as we've talked about previously, the expungement bill. Different victories like that as well are important for the defense bar to understand and to communicate to their clients.
Well, there's another area that the public misses in this whole criminal justice reform effort as well, and that's supervision reform. Take a couple of minutes and just talk about some of the issues involved in supervision reform with respect to individuals convicted of felonies.
Sure. So at Prison Fellowship, we believe that community supervision should be swift and proportional in order to best serve the interests of the community. At Prison Fellowship, we do have 1 in 4 of our employees that have been previously incarcerated. And so firsthand at our organization, we have seen that there is really a wide variety of the quality of supervision that exists across our nation. And when we think about community supervision, we often have very lengthy periods of community supervision, and it's very important that when somebody is on community supervision, that it's narrowly tailored and that what somebody is imposed is not overly long or overly restrictive. Just to provide an example, if you have a low-risk defendant and they're having to do electronic monitoring, they're having to do very frequent check-ins, they're having to go to also things like frequent drug testing, that can be really difficult for somebody who is trying to hold down a stable job, be there with their family, be able to provide for their family.
Well, not only that, it's expensive.
Yes, it's expensive as well.
So for this audience, Sarah, you're not talking about somebody who gets a 2-year suspended sentence. Many of these sentences are extremely lengthy, like 10 and 15-year suspended sentences, right?
I can't recall offhand, and Damien might know, the average probation length in Oklahoma, but I do know that we have one of the longest average probation lengths. And when we are sentencing low-risk defendants to unnecessarily lengthy probation sentences, then we are stewarding resources on these low-risk defendants that can be better served for somebody that is high risk and might need more assistance in order to turn their life around.
Okay, thank you for that commentary. Damien, finally, I'd like for you to address for the audience the points at which our nonprofit and all of these other community agencies that we have out there, how are they failing Oklahomans in trying to impact the criminal justice system? What is it we need from them?
Well, it's tricky, right? I don't want to blame the nonprofit sort of complex for the problems, right? They're one of the parts of this state that's working to try and redress those issues. But I'd say the biggest failings that we're seeing in our state are those structural issues, right? The fact that about 50 of our counties are relatively rural and they don't have the access to technology, jobs, resources, childcare, right? Simple things that we don't often think about. But as a parent, I think about all the time, right? If you give me court appearances and therapy appearances and other things that I have to do to meet my court-ordered supervision requirements, how in the world am I supposed to pick my kids up from school?
Right.
How am I supposed to work a 9-to-5 job when I got to be at an appearance at 1 p.m. and maybe I have to show up at 10 a.m. and just sit there and wait for hours, right? If I want to be a good citizen, I want to do everything the courts told me to do. We have immediately put this insane barrier in front of people to say, work all the time, pay all the debts you owe courts. We might take your driver's license, so hopefully that won't make it worse. And make sure you show up for every urine analysis and everything we want during work hours, and hope your boss won't fire you for that. Good luck. Right? Like, that is the dynamic. That is the structure. We are setting up too many Oklahomans to fail, and we don't have to.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I want to take a minute now to take some questions from the audience. If you have, anyone out there have any questions? We've got about 10 or 15 minutes reserved to respond to the questions from the audience. I will. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? I'll bring the mic to you. Just raise your hand. Thank you.
There's a gentleman on the right. That's a question too.
I was just wondering, how hard would it be to get the money from, like, Governor Stitt, the money that he owes the residents here to help build community programs like Diversion Hub and Team in these rural communities? I mean, how hard is it, when the money is already supposed to be allocated to the citizens for these types of issues? How do we start?
So, something that's really important to be honest about is the power that even this little group of people in this room have. When I talk to lawmakers, legislators, on a regular basis, they say the same thing. If 8 to 10 people call my office telling me they care about something, it's shocking. I said 8 to 10 people, not 100, not 1,000, not, some massive amount of people, 8 to 10 folks. There is a coalition that is forming. Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform is happy to be one of the leaders in that coalition to get the money that the citizens of Oklahoma are owed for mental health, addiction, and crisis treatment right now, and we hope that you will join us. There are groups from across the political spectrum represented here, so I have no dog in the fight. If you want to join with Americans for Prosperity or Right on Crime and do the more conservative-leaning version of this, or you want to join with groups like the ACLU and the Bail Project and do more progressive activism, either way, please make your voice heard. You're more powerful than you think you are. Again, 8 to 10 people call a lawmaker's office and they're shocked. Get on the phone, join 7 of your friends from church, 7 of your friends from your community, your work, or your groups. You really can make a difference.
Wonderful. Any other questions? There's one back here.
Of course, I'd like to begin by talking about myself. I came to this thing tonight with really high expectations, and you have far exceeded those expectations. And just want to say, Damon, you've done just a great job with this
Wonderful.
thing. My question is actually, hey, sure. My question is for Professor Radford, correct? You said earlier, let me look it up. Oh, shoot, hold on. Bear with me, please. Bear with me. I'm looking up your quote, which I wrote down. Okay, here it is. You said, is a man more or less guilty on the day he is accused of his crime as he is on the day a jury finds him not guilty? If I understand you correctly, what you're saying is oftentimes the process is the punishment. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, and you got one word in the wrong place, but it basically the question to ask in that case is a man as innocent on the day he's charged with a crime, understanding that we have the presumption of innocence in our American jurisprudence, right? As he is on the day after a trial when he gets a not guilty. When was he innocent? That's the question asked in the criminal justice system. All of the concepts and the policies that you've heard our panel talk about here tonight, these are all the questions along the spectrum that impact the presumption of innocence in the American jurisprudence. And so what we try to do in the educational component of criminal justice reform is show people how all of these policy decisions impact the presumption of innocence, the very thing that our criminal justice system is founded upon. I would encourage you to read that case, United States versus Salerno, and it is a case that challenges the pretrial detention system act in the federal government. In the federal government, there's a little difference between how we detain people. There is a presumption that you will not be detained in the federal system. And of course, we all know how the state system works, which is why our local jails are full. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. United States versus Salerno, S-A-L-E-R-N-O.
Can I say something really quickly about the presumption of innocence I think about a lot? Oklahoma is one of those wild states with some of the longest pretrial detention. That is,
yes,
you've been locked up in jail, you're not convicted of a crime, but you're sitting there. Either because you've been denied bail or you more often can't afford bail, right? In Oklahoma, there are numerous counties where the median pretrial jail stay for nonviolent felony offenders was longer than 6 months.
Right.
Longer than 6 months. So something I like to ask quite often is, what does the presumption of innocence mean? If they can jail you for more than 6 months on average because you're poor.
Right.
What good is the presumption of innocence to that American when they are gone, their freedom is gone, their child is gone, their family is gone, their ability to work is gone for months without a trial? It is one of the most despicable, to my mind, elements of our system that we don't say that we can't separate you from your kids for months. We can't separate you from your job and your life and everything you care about for months without a legal process that's been fully vetted and explored to some meaningful extent. The presumption of innocence should mean more in Oklahoma.
Right. And just to highlight that, the biggest problem, people will plead guilty to crimes they did not commit just to get out of jail. Right. And
absolutely.
so
and you have to think about the misery machine, right?
Right.
If you're sitting there and someone says, well, if you roll the dice and you take this to trial, because Oklahoma has some of the longest prison sentences in the world, you might never see your baby again, right? 4 to life is lots and lots of offenses in the felony classification system in Oklahoma. So your little girl, you might never see her again, or at least she might be fully grown before you ever get back. And so if you say, hey, do 5 to 10 and you'll see your little girl again, just sign this paper whether you did it or not. Think of how coercive that power is. See your baby girl again before she grows up. If you sign this paper, don't sign this paper, take it to trial. You might not see her again.
Right. Right. Any other questions from the audience? Great questions, by the way. There's one in that corner too.
Greg Martin, CEO. Y'all doing a great job here. A lot of questions been answered, but my question is, how do we break down the taking away of their driving license? You know, most of the time when you come out of jail, you can get a job with a driver's license, but if you got fines, of course you know this, what is the XYZ plan to what we can do? Yes, we know the problem, but what can we do?
Who'd like to address that question? Sarah, maybe that's a good question for you.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, we did have a great bill in 2019 that reduced some of the driver's license suspensions for failure to pay fines and fees. But a driver's license is, especially in a state like Oklahoma, necessary for somebody to be able to live and thrive. We don't have public transportation across the state. We don't have people that can often live and work and thrive if they do not have a driver's license. So I know that we also had recently the Sarah Stitt Act to provide people identification cards, which is a barrier to being able to get employment whenever you don't have an ID. But the more that we can do I don't have a specific policy proposal today to help more people have a driver's license in the state of Oklahoma. Maybe one of y'all do, but I definitely think the more that we can do to help that to not be a burden to people, the better, because it is so fundamental to people being able to get back on their feet and live and work and thrive.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we had another question here in the back.
So my question is, when we talk about how much money we are paying into the prisons, knowing that 90% of our prisons are privatized, so what is the plan to get rid of that?
It would take another panel presentation to talk about privatized prisons. Nonetheless, certainly, of course, nobody likes them. But would somebody here on the panel, because that's part of the monster that's been created. We are now creating more profit in the criminal justice system. That's not what we want. Would anyone on the panel like to address that?
Real quick, I don't have a plan, no. But I can tell you that in the last 4 years, a private prison has been closed in the state of Oklahoma. And I can tell you, share an anecdote. I was in a room when that was announced in a speech to the almost the entirety of the House of Representatives, and it received a standing ovation. And so I think that says a lot,
right,
about where the legislature views the future of this issue and the intent there. It's going to take a lot of smart people in the room to come up with a plan to figure it all the way out, but I think the momentum is in the right direction on that particular issue.
The only thing
Are you on?
The only thing I want to add, I agree with everything that Adam said there, and it was really a hopeful moment to see those lawmakers responding in that way. I like to say every time a prison closes, an angel gets their wings.
Right.
So much of that is dependent on you. It's dependent on the public. Making it clear you want solutions to these problems that don't involve more incarceration. Oklahoma's in a wild position, right? We have so much more incarceration than most of the rest of the free world that we could actually reduce it in a fairly responsible and methodical way without terrifying results to public safety. We could just get closer to normal and start making those first steps and really closing some of these prisons that don't have any purpose. The fun secret about private prisons, they are not less expensive than the public variety. We've seen that in the budgeting process the last few years when private prisons have asked for more and more supplemental appropriations to keep the lights on. That dynamic is the dynamic that we use to close them. They don't make financial sense, and they are, in fact, a moral travesty. Both of those facts, I think, have to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Damien. Any other questions for the audience? I think we might have time for one or two more.
I have a question. I'm a middle school teacher, and I can't help but think during this entire presentation about how these stories directly affect my students and the community at large. And I'm wondering, as I see these cycles continue, when my students are affected by their adults that are incarcerated, and how those children are more likely to then become part of the system as well, how do we provide the support for our communities to stop these cycles and to support these kids and their families so that they can heal?
You want to talk about restorative justice?
How much time do we have?
Right.
I think that's an excellent question. So prior coming to the ACLU, I used to work within victim services. So we saw a lot of survivors of domestic and sexual violence trying to navigate the criminal legal system because, like Damien said at the very beginning, a lot of survivors were fighting back and ending up in prison for doing so. And they were leaving, and they had a lot of children, and they were leaving them behind. So when it came to working in victim services, we had to ask ourselves this really difficult question of how much we were contributing to the carceral system ourselves, which I think is a whole nother panel that we can ask. But when it comes to your question of how do we create cycles of care and trust and community versus engaging in the carceral system, I think the first answer is getting to know your neighbors. I think that's really simple, but getting to know your neighbors. Do you even know the people that you live next to you? If something happens to your family member, if something happens to your dog and you are not home, are you able to text them? Are they able to text you or call you or ask somebody in your family, is everything okay on your end? Can I do anything for you? Something as simple as having dinner and getting to know your neighbors, but as well as creating systems of care within the communities around you as well. So getting to know your child's teachers, getting to know the people in their lives, and talking about when it comes to restorative justice, I think, as well as transformative justice, because I see restorative justice as between two people, but transformative justice is creating the conditions that don't allow or don't have that individual creating that harm once again. So having those systems put in place. What are some things that we can do to prevent somebody from engaging and harming somebody else? And we have had these really difficult questions of, it's really easy to lock somebody up and throw away the key and not look at them as a human being. It is another thing to ask ourselves, how do we look at somebody else in a way that also engages with their own humanity? Asking them questions of why did they commit this harm to the other person, and realizing that oftentimes they are trying to survive as well. So I don't know if I particularly answered your questions, but there are many, many resources on restorative justice that I'm happy to talk to you about after this as well.
All right.
Could I add a couple thoughts?
Yes, Sarah.
One other thing that I think of when I think about how can we break these cycles is a lot of times whenever people are in prison and then they don't have anything to do that is productive while in prison, they're just learning more criminal behaviors. So when I think about breaking the cycle, I think about access to programming and education and people that volunteer and work in prisons to provide these programs that people can learn a trade, learn to better themselves, get excited about doing something, or like through our Prison Fellowship Academy, learning to transform their life and things like that is really fundamental to people succeeding and breaking the cycle when coming out of prison. And another thing that another example that I thought of is my church here in Oklahoma City, Crossings Community Church. They recently hosted a reentry fair where business leaders and owners can come and learn about second chance hiring and the importance of giving people opportunities when coming out of prison. So I think that the more that the local church and different organizations really think about how can we love our brothers and sisters that are coming out of incarceration is really important as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I hate to end this beautiful conversation. I hope you've had a good learning experience here this evening about the policy issues that Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform will be tackling next year. I'd like for you to give this incredible panel a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And now I would like for Angela Munson to come forward and give us a closing and a call to action.
Let's give this panel one more round of applause. And I know we're recording or this is streaming, but I'm going to move because I want to really speak to you tonight for just a few moments. So I don't want to be in this little box, so forgive me, those of you who might be watching online. I hope you can hear me. You know, as I listen to these panelists speak this evening, and that includes you, my friend Loretta, I experienced this whole range of emotions. From really being angry about some of the things that I heard you say, to being in a real celebratory mode because we have been successful, to really just feeling sad because I personally understand some of the stories and experiences and things that were talked about tonight. When I was a 15, 16-year-old kid, a long time ago, my mom's oldest child, my brother, had his first experience of incarceration. And I was a kid, but I remember going with my mom and my dad to visit him in one of Oklahoma's really horrible prisons at the time. And my brother, Herman Jr., had a baby on one of his periods of time out of incarceration. That baby was 2 years old when he went back. And that baby was 26 years old when he came home and stayed.
Wow.
You know, I think about that. I think about how when I was a first-year college student, my uncle worked for, I'm dating myself, this organization called Volunteers in Corrections. And they went and they sought people out who were being released from prison. And they helped them. And they tried to move them into this process of reestablishing themselves. And I said, I want to do that. I want to do something like that. I wanted to make a difference because I knew how hard it was. So I decided I'm going to major in corrections, and I did. And I was a probation and parole officer. And I realized this is not what I signed up for. I'm not helping anybody. The rules were horrible. And I would just turn the other way. I wouldn't write that report. I wouldn't send them back. They didn't deserve to go back to prison for doing that. Oh no, I'm not gonna do that. Well, it didn't take me long to realize, you know, I could look the other way so many times and I needed a job, so let me go find something else to do. And I went to work for any number of years for one of those other community organizations, the CREO, Council for Resocialization for Ex-Offenders. And I spent 3.5, almost 4 years of my life trying to move, not just adults, but young people too, who were engaged in this crazy system into a life of prosperity and one that they could be hopeful and they could experience things as well. And it took me all of that time. I was a kid, mind you, when I started to realize, you know what, this is just not working well. I'm going to go somewhere and be a rule maker. Because it was the rules that needed to change. It was the policies that needed to change. It was the things that the people who had the power needed to do differently to change people's lives. Now that was a long time ago. And I'm still trying to change the rules. We all are still trying to change the rules by which just regular people have to play by. People who just want to have a life, who want to be able to, as Damien said, see their girls, see their daughters, see their children grow up, who want to just go to work every day, who want to enjoy a good evening conversation or dinner with the family. You know what? Those rules still need to be changed, and they won't change unless we do something. My favorite quote is, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will."
Right.
It's a Frederick Douglass quote. I believe that in earnest about all the things that we do. Everything that's been said here must change, but it won't change. It will not change unless we do something. Do we not have a moral obligation to do something to make life better for those people that we sit next to, that we work next to, that we drive down the street and see in their car? We don't even know them, but wonder, are they having a good day or a bad day? Am I not my brother and my sister's keeper? I think I am. I think I do have a moral responsibility. You see, these issues that we've talked about and the question asked last are so intersectional. We can't fix this criminal justice system without changing policies in healthcare. We can't change healthcare without changing policies in education. We can't change education without changing employment practices and eviction and all those things that matter in people's lives. So no matter what your issue is, you're here tonight because you're concerned about criminal justice. But I implore you to really understand that there are so many other issues that we have to work on. And don't think like I thought as a 15-year-old that I had to be like Martin Luther King and take the weight of the world on my shoulders. You can do a little just where you are.
Yes.
Whatever time, whatever energy, whatever expertise that you have, you can make a difference. So, in a shameless commercial, I work for Together Oklahoma Policy. We do a lot of work. We have groups of individuals around the state. You can join us. We'll show you how. Damien said it. There are organizations represented here. Join them. There's more work. The laborers are few, and the fields are plentiful, and we need you. So pick a place. Pick a place, decide what you want to do. Pick a place, and if nothing else, as I take my seat, because it doesn't take but a little time on one particular day, if you want to really change the rules, go vote. God bless you, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If I might just give one shout out to the organizer, planner from Oklahomans for Criminal Justice, Evita Fox. Where are you? Wonderful job. And all of the staff who assisted her in making this an incredible educational event about the policy reform ideas for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice. Thank you all.